25,000 feet above Nazi Germany, 1943. The air is so cold it burns your lungs, so thin that every breath feels like drowning. Inside the tail turret of a B-17 Flying Fortress, Staff Sergeant Donald Crossley sits alone. Completely alone. Separated from his crew by 70 feet of aircraft fuselage, facing backward, staring into the empty sky behind the bomber formation. But the sky isn't empty anymore. "Bandits! 6 o'clock high! Fighters coming in!" The radio explodes with voices. Panicked. Urgent. Crossley's hands tighten on the grips of his twin 50 caliber machine guns. Through the plexiglass bubble of his turret, he counts them. 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. At least 8 German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, the Luftwaffe's best, diving toward the B-17 formation like wolves targeting the weakest sheep in the herd. And Crossley knows something every tail gunner knows. When fighters attack from 6 o'clock, the tail gunner dies first. It's simple math, simple geometry. The tail turret sits at the furthest point of the bomber, completely exposed. No armor in front of you, just plexiglass and freezing air between you and 20mm cannons that can tear a man apart. Statistics don't lie. Tail gunners have one of the highest casualty rates in the entire 8th Air Force. Many never complete their 25-mission tour. Most end up as statistics in after-action reports. Tail gunner KIA, killed in action. Crossley watches the fighters grow larger, 400 miles per hour closure rate. In seconds, they'll be in firing range. In seconds, they'll open up with cannon fire, and he'll have maybe 2 seconds to shoot back before... But Crossley doesn't wait. At 1,000 yards, far beyond the range recommended in every gunnery manual, he opens fire. The twin 50s roar to life. Tracers arc out into the thin air, bright orange streaks cutting across the grey German sky. He's not aiming at individual aircraft, he's sweeping the entire stream of tracers across the lead fighter's flight path. "Tail, what the hell are you doing?" The waist gunner's voice crackles over the intercom. "They're not even in range yet." "He's going to be dry when they actually get here," someone else shouts. But Crossley doesn't stop. He keeps firing. Long, sustained bursts that the gunnery instructors back in training specifically told him never to do. Waste of ammunition, they said. Save it for when they're close. But Crossley learned something those instructors never learned. When you wait for the enemy to get close, you're already dead. The lead Bf-109 sees the tracer stream. At 600 miles per hour, even a small course correction is violent. The pilot banks hard right. Too hard. His wingman, following tight formation, doesn't react fast enough, nearly collides, breaks left. The entire German formation scatters. What should have been a coordinated, devastating attack from 6 o'clock, 8 fighters focusing fire on the most vulnerable part of the bomber formation, turns into chaos. Fighters breaking in different directions, losing their firing solutions, losing their angles of attack. One Focke-Wulf 190 doesn't break fast enough. Crossley's tracers walk right into it. 50 caliber rounds, each one half an inch in diameter, weighing nearly 2 ounces, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, smash into the fighter's engine cowling. Black smoke erupts. The FW-190 shudders, rolls, begins to spiral. A white parachute blossoms against the grey clouds. The German pilot bails out. One less fighter, one less threat, but 7 more are still out there. The B-17 formation holds steady, no stragglers, no crippled bombers falling out of formation to be picked off like wounded animals. The other gunners are firing now, top turret, ball turret, waist guns, but the German attack is already broken. And then through the intercom, the pilot's voice, "Tail, whoever's back there, keep doing that." Crossley doesn't respond. He's already scanning the sky, already looking for the next attack. Because there's always a next attack. His fingers are numb inside his heated gloves. His ammunition counter shows he's burned through 200 rounds in less than 30 seconds. The textbook says that's reckless, suicidal even, but Crossley is still alive, and that German pilot floating down under his parachute, he's not? Here's the question that newspaper reporters would ask months later when they learned about Staff Sergeant Donald Crossley. When they learned he'd shot down 12 German fighters, when they learned he'd become the highest-scoring aerial gunner in the entire European theater of operations. The question was simple. How does a tail gunner, sitting in the most dangerous position on the most dangerous bombers flying the most dangerous missions of World War II, How does he survive long enough to become an ace? How does a man using a tactic that everyone called suicidal live long enough to tell the story? The answer isn't what you'd expect, because Donald Crossley didn't survive by following the rules. He survived by breaking them. Wellsburg, West Virginia, 1941. If you asked anyone in this small steel town along the Ohio River to pick out a future war hero, Donald Crossley wouldn't have been on the list. He wasn't a star athlete. Wasn't a crackshot who grew up hunting in the Appalachian Hills. Wasn't one of those kids who talked about joining the military since he could walk. He was just ordinary. He worked. He got by. Like thousands of other young men in Depression-era America, Crossley did what he had to do to help his family survive. The 1930s weren't kind to places like Wellsburg. Steel mills ran half shifts. Jobs were scarce. Futures were uncertain. And then December 7th, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Within weeks, recruiting stations across America were flooded with young men. Some went out of patriotism. Some went for adventure. Some went because the military offered 3 meals a day and a paycheck, which was more than a lot of civilian jobs could promise. Crossley enlisted in 1942, not in the Army Infantry, not in the Navy. He volunteered for the Army Air Forces, the branch that flew the big 4-engine bombers deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. It was, statistically speaking, one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire war. But Crossley didn't know that yet. The training was brutal. First came basic training, then gunnery school. Crossley showed aptitude with the .50 caliber machine guns, not exceptional, but solid. Good enough to be assigned to a bomber crew. Good enough to be given one of the most critical positions on a B-17 Flying Fortress. Tail gunner. The instructors explained it simply. You're the eyes in the back of the aircraft. You watch for fighters coming from the rear. You call out attacks. You defend the formation. What they didn't say, what nobody said out loud, was that tail gunners died at a higher rate than almost any other crew position. Think about it from a tactical perspective. German fighter pilots weren't stupid. They knew that B-17s had guns pointing in almost every direction. Top turret, ball turret, waist guns, nose guns, overlapping fields of fire designed to create a box of death that no fighter could penetrate. But there were weak points, and the tail was one of them, a single gunner. Sitting alone at the back of the aircraft. If you're a Luftwaffe pilot, that's your target. Attack from 6 o'clock straight up the tail. Overwhelm that one gunner before the others can traverse their guns to help. Simple, effective, deadly. Crossley learned all this in training, learned the doctrine, learned the manual, learned the proper way to defend a bomber from fighter attack. Wait until the enemy is within effective range, 400 to 600 yards. Fire-controlled bursts, 3 to 5 second bursts maximum, to conserve ammunition. Aim for the engine or cockpit. Disable the fighter. Don't waste ammo trying to blow it apart. Stay calm. Stay disciplined. Trust the system. And Crossley took notes, passed his tests, qualified as a tail gunner. But even in training, something didn't sit right with him. The doctrine made sense on paper. Conserve ammunition, wait for high percentage shots, maintain discipline. But there was a problem. During practice exercises, trainee gunners defending against simulated fighter attacks, Crossley noticed something. While he was waiting for the optimal engagement zone, the attacking aircraft had all the time in the world to line up their approach, to choose their angle, to get into perfect position. By the time the manual said he could fire, the enemy had already dictated the terms of the fight. Fellow gunners from the 95th Bomb Group would later recall that Crossley asked uncomfortable questions during training. Questions that instructors didn't always want to answer. Questions like, if we wait for them to get close, don't they shoot first? The standard response was always the same. You follow the manual. The manual is based on combat experience. Long-range shooting wastes ammunition. When the real fight comes and you're empty, you'll wish you'd conserved your ammo, and on the surface, that logic was sound. But Crossley kept thinking about it, kept turning it over in his mind, because there was another way to look at it. What if the goal wasn't to conserve ammunition? What if the goal was to never let the enemy get into position to shoot in the first place? What if, instead of waiting to defend, you attacked first? It was a thought that contradicted everything in the gunnery manual, everything the instructors taught. A tail gunner's job was defensive, react to threats, protect the aircraft, not hunt. But Crossley couldn't shake the idea, and he filed it away, tucked it into the back of his mind. wondering if he'd ever get a chance or need to test it. In May 1943, Crossley shipped out to England. He was assigned to the 335th Bomb Squadron, 95th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force. The 95th operated out of Horham Airfield in Suffolk, flying B-17F Flying Fortresses on daylight bombing raids deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. His aircraft was called the Brass Rail. The crew welcomed him. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, flight engineer, waist gunners, ball turret gunner. 10 men crammed into a 4-engine bomber, flying into the teeth of the German air defense network. And Crossley, sitting furthest back, would be the last line of defense. The night before his first mission, he cleaned his guns, meticulously. The twin 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the tail turret, each gun capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, each round capable of punching through aircraft aluminum like paper. He loaded the ammunition belts, checked the feed mechanisms, tested the turret rotation, everything by the book. But in his mind, he was already thinking about what would happen when the book wasn't enough. When doctrine met reality at 25,000 feet over Nazi Germany. When staying alive meant doing something everyone would call crazy. He didn't know it yet, but that moment was coming soon. Very soon. If you weren't there, you can't understand what it was like. That's what veterans of the 8th Air Force said after the war. You can read the reports, study the statistics, watch the documentaries. But unless you climbed into a B-17 at dawn, knowing there was a very real chance you wouldn't come back, you simply can't know. The numbers tell part of the story. In 1943, the average lifespan of a bomber crew in the European theater was 15 missions. 15. Your required tour of duty? 25 missions. Do the math. Most crews didn't make it. The 8th Air Force would eventually suffer the highest casualty rate of any American military unit in World War II, over 26,000 men killed. Another 28,000 captured or missing. Out of roughly 350,000 who served, that's a 77% casualty rate. And in 1943, before long-range fighter escorts, before improved tactics, before the Luftwaffe was worn down, it was even worse. Donald Crossley arrived at Horham Airfield in the May 1943, right in the middle of what historians would later call the most dangerous period of the entire bombing campaign. Horham sat in the English countryside of Suffolk, about 90 miles northeast of London. Flat fields, grey skies, rows of Nissen huts where crews slept, ate, and tried not to think about the next mission. The 95th Bomb Group operated from Horham, one of dozens of bomber groups scattered across East Anglia, all with the same mission: strategic daylight bombing of Nazi Germany. The theory was simple. The British bombed at night. The Americans bombed during the day, around-the-clock pressure on German industry, infrastructure, and morale. The reality was brutal. Daylight bombing meant German fighters could see you coming from miles away. Meant flak gunners had clear visibility, meant every mission was a running battle from the moment you crossed the enemy coast until, if you were lucky, you made it back to England. The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to solve this problem. Heavy armor, 10 machine guns. Crews called it the Flying Fortress because it could supposedly defend itself without fighter escort. Tight formations created overlapping fields of fire. No German fighter could penetrate the box of death created by dozens of bombers flying together. That was the theory. The reality? German fighters adapted. Luftwaffe pilots learned to attack from angles where the B-17's defensive fire was weakest. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock, straight through the front, where only the nose guns could engage. Or attacks from 6 o'clock, straight up the tail, where only the tail gunner stood between them and the bomber's vulnerable rear. And they attacked in waves. First wave, disrupt the formation, force bombers to break apart. Second wave, pick off the stragglers, the damaged aircraft, the ones that couldn't keep up. Third wave, finish them off. It was systematic, professional, deadly. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe had refined these tactics into a science. Experienced pilots in fast, heavily armed fighters like the Bf-109 and FW-190, they knew exactly where to hit, exactly how to kill a B-17, and the bombers kept dying. This was the world Donald Crossley entered when he joined the 95th Bomb Group. His first briefing was like every first briefing. Crews gathered in a large Nissen hut before dawn, maps on the wall, intelligence officers pointing at targets deep in Germany. Emden, Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, names that meant nothing to most Americans, but everything to bomber crews. These were heavily defended ports, submarine pens, industrial centers, the heart of the Nazi war machine. And getting there meant flying hundreds of miles over occupied Europe, over France, over the Netherlands, over Germany itself, through flak fields that turned the sky black with exploding shells, through fighter zones where Luftwaffe squadrons waited like wolves. The briefing officer would explain the route, the target, the expected opposition. Expect heavy fighter resistance over the target area. That was code for, a lot of you won't be coming back. And then crews would walk out to their aircraft, climb aboard, fire up the engines, taxi into formation, take off into the pre-dawn darkness, and hope. The tail gunner position had a reputation. Every position on a B-17 was dangerous. But tail gunner, that was special. You sat in a tiny plexiglass bubble at the very back of the aircraft, completely isolated from the rest of the crew, connected only by intercom. Behind you, nothing, just empty air and German fighters. The view was unobstructed. You could see everything behind the formation, watch other bombers, watch for fighters, watch friends die, because that's what happened when fighters attacked from the rear. You had the best view in the aircraft, the clearest view, and that meant you saw things nobody else saw. You saw the B-17 300 yards behind you take a direct hit from a 20mm cannon. Saw it explode. Saw men, your friends, guys you played cards with the night before, tumbling through the sky. You saw parachutes, sometimes. If the crew had time to bail out, if the aircraft didn't disintegrate too fast. You saw empty spaces in the formation where aircraft used to be, and you knew, next time, that could be you. The tail turret itself was a masterpiece of cramped engineering. 2 50 caliber machine guns, 1,600 rounds of ammunition total, 800 per gun, enough for about 1 minute of continuous fire, though nobody fired continuously. Short bursts, controlled fire, make every round count. The turret rotated and elevated using electric motors. A reflector gun sight helped with aiming. Heated flight suit kept you from freezing to death. Outside temperature at 25,000 feet could drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was your world. For 6 hours, 8 hours, sometimes 10 hours on long missions deep into Germany. Alone with your guns and your thoughts and the knowledge that you were the last man between the formation and the fighters coming up from behind. Oh! The 95th Bomb Group had a saying, "We lead the way." They were one of the original 8th Air Force groups, flew some of the earliest missions, took some of the heaviest losses. By the time Crossley arrived, the 95th had already lost dozens of aircraft, hundreds of men. The group would eventually fly over 320 missions before the war ended. 800 aircraft lost or damaged, thousands of casualties. And in May 1943, they were just getting started. This was the context Donald Crossley stepped into. This was the machine he was now part of. A machine that consumed young men and turned them into statistics. Most tail gunners lasted a handful of missions before they were killed, wounded, or shot down and captured. The few who survived longer did so through a combination of skill, luck, and pure, stubborn refusal to die. Crossley would need all three. But he had something else, too. Something that would separate him from every other tail gunner in the 8th Air Force. He had an idea that everyone would call suicidal. An idea that would keep him alive long enough to become a legend. But first, he had to survive his first mission. June 22nd, 1943, Donald Crossley's first combat mission. Target, Hüls, Germany, a synthetic rubber plant deep in the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. The briefing had been straightforward. Take off at 0600 hours, form up over England, cross the channel, navigate to target, drop bombs, come home. Simple on paper. But as the brass rail climbed to altitude and joined the bomber stream heading east, Crossley realized that nothing about this was simple. Through the plexiglass of his tail turret, he watched the English coast disappear behind them, watched the dark blue of the channel pass beneath, watched the coast of occupied Europe appear ahead like a threat on the horizon. And then they crossed into enemy territory. The flak started over the Dutch coast, black puffs of smoke appearing in the sky around the formation. German 88 mm anti-aircraft guns firing from the ground, sending shells up to burst at bomber altitude. Each explosion created a cloud of shrapnel capable of shredding aluminum and flesh. The bombers couldn't evade, couldn't dodge. They had to hold formation, hold course, fly straight into it. Crossley felt the brass rail shudder as a shell burst nearby, close enough to hear, close enough to feel, not close enough to kill, not this time. Over the intercom, the pilot's voice, "Steady, boys, we're not even to the target yet." And Crossley understood with cold clarity that this was going to be a long day. The fighter attacks started 30 minutes from the target. "Bandits, 10 o'clock high!" Crossley couldn't see them from his position. The tail turret faced backward. He could only see what was behind the formation, but he heard the waist gunners calling out positions, heard the top turret open fire, heard the sharp staccato burst of 50 caliber guns, and then they came from behind. 3 BF-109s, diving out of the sun, coming in fast from 6 o'clock. This was it, his first real engagement. Crossley's hands tightened on the gun grips, his eye pressed against the reflector sight. His thumb hovered over the firing triggers. He remembered the manual, remembered the training. Wait for them to enter effective range. 400 to 600 yards. Don't fire early. Don't waste ammunition. The fighters grew larger, closer, 600 yards, 500 yards. And then, at exactly 400 yards, exactly when the manual said, Crossley opened fire. Short, controlled bursts. 3 seconds, pause. 3 seconds, pause. His tracers reached out toward the lead BF-109. The German pilot saw them coming. Rolled left. Dove under the formation. The 2 wingmen followed. No hits. The attack broke off. Over the intercom, "Good shooting, Tail. Kept them honest." But Crossley didn't feel good about it, because he'd followed the manual perfectly, and all he'd accomplished was making the fighters break off. They'd be back. They were. Over the target, while the bombardier lined up for the bomb run and the formation had to fly straight and level, unable to maneuver, the Luftwaffe came back, this time in force. 6 fighters, then 8, then more, attacking from multiple angles, head-on passes that made the entire bomber shudder, beam attacks from 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and always attacks from the rear. Crossley fired until his guns were hot, until his ammunition counter showed he was down to half, until the turret stank of cordite and gun oil and fear. He scored hits, saw his tracers walk into an FW-190's wing, saw pieces fly off, saw the fighter wobble and dive away, but he didn't see it go down, didn't see it destroyed. Damage, not a kill. Around him, the formation was taking losses. A B-17 2 positions ahead took a direct hit to the number 3 engine. Fire erupted. The bomber began to fall out of formation, losing altitude, slowing down. Stragglers didn't last long. Crossley watched 3 fighters swarm the damaged bomber like sharks sensing blood, watched it take hit after hit, watched it roll onto its back and begin the long fall to earth. He counted parachutes. 4, 5, 6. 4 men didn't make it out. The brass rail made it home that day. They landed at Horham with holes in the fuselage, 1 engine running rough, and a crew that didn't talk much during debriefing. Crossley's official score for the mission, 0 confirmed kills, possible damage to 1 enemy aircraft. The group lost 3 bombers, 30 men, some dead, some prisoners of war, some would never be found. And Crossley sat in the mess hall that night, eating food he couldn't taste, thinking about what he'd seen. He'd done everything right, followed the manual, fired at the correct range, conserved ammunition, and men had still died. The missions continued. June 25th. Target, Hamburg. Heavy fighters. 2 bombers lost. June 26th. Target, Villacoublay, France. Moderate opposition. 1 bomber lost. June 28th. Target, Saint-Nazaire. The U-boat pens on the French coast. Intense flak. Heavy fighters. 4 bombers lost. And Crossley, in the tail turret of the brass rail, kept following the manual. Wait for effective range. Controlled bursts. Conserve ammunition. He was getting better. Scored his first confirmed kill on the Saint-Nazaire mission, an FW-190, that made the mistake of staying in his sights too long. Took hits to the engine and wing root, went down trailing smoke. 1 kill. But it didn't feel like victory, because every mission he watched the same thing happen. German fighters would set up their attacks from long range, take their time, choose their angles, and by the time bomber gunners could effectively engage, by the time the manual said they were in range, the Germans had already dictated the terms of the fight. The defenders were always reacting, always one step behind, and in air combat, being reactive meant being dead. There was a moment, Crossley would remember it years later, when the realization crystallized. It was during the mission to Wilhelmshaven on July the 4th, 1943. Independence Day. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The formation was inbound to target when a full squadron of German fighters appeared behind them. At least 12 aircraft, Bf-109s and FW-190s mixed together. They didn't attack immediately. They hung back, just outside effective range, pacing the bombers. Crossley watched them through his gun sight, watched them organize, watched the lead aircraft signal to the others, coordinating their assault. They were taking their time, because they knew the bombers couldn't touch them at this range, knew they could set up the perfect attack, knew they held all the cards. And the bomber gunners? They just had to wait, watch, hope their number didn't come up. It was in that moment, watching death organize itself in his gun sight, that Crossley made a decision. The manual was wrong. Not wrong in theory, not wrong in training, but wrong here, wrong in this sky, wrong against pilots who had learned to exploit the doctrine's weaknesses. If he kept waiting for enemies to enter effective range, he'd eventually end up like those men he'd watched tumble from burning bombers. The doctrine was designed to keep you alive by being conservative. But conservative tactics against aggressive enemies didn't keep you alive. They made you a victim. And Donald Crossley decided, somewhere over the North Sea on the 4th of July, 1943, that he was done being a victim. The next time fighters lined up behind his formation, he wasn't going to wait. He was going to do something that would make everyone think he'd lost his mind. He was going to attack first. July 17th, 1943. The target was Hanover, a deep penetration into Germany. Industrial facilities, rail yards, targets that mattered to the Nazi war machine, which meant the Luftwaffe would defend it with everything they had. The briefing officer hadn't sugarcoated it. Expect maximum fighter opposition, all the way to target and all the way back. As the brass rail formed up with the rest of the 95th Bomb Group and climbed to altitude, Crossley ran through his pre-flight checks one more time. Guns loaded, turret operational, ammunition belts feeding smoothly. But this time, there was something different. This time, he wasn't planning to follow the manual. The fighter attacks started exactly where intelligence said they would. Over the German border as the bomber stream pushed deeper into enemy territory. Crossley saw them first. Fighters, 6 o'clock high, about a dozen of them, forming up. The radio crackled with acknowledgements from other positions. The formation tightened. Gunners across the bomber stream swiveled their weapons toward the threat, and Crossley watched. The German fighters were doing exactly what they always did, hanging back, just outside the 400-yard effective range that every American gunnery manual talked about, taking their time, organizing their attack. The lead fighter, a Bf-109 with yellow nose markings, waggled its wings, a signal. The squadron began to spread out, preparing for a coordinated assault from multiple angles. In 30 seconds, maybe less, they'd be in position. They'd dive in together, overwhelm the defensive fire with numbers and speed. And some of those bombers, maybe the brass rail, maybe one of the others, would go down. That was how it always worked. But Crossley wasn't going to let it work that way this time. At 1,000 yards, far beyond the range where the manual said he should even consider firing, Donald Crossley squeezed the triggers. No, the twin 50 caliber machine guns roared to life, traces arced out across the sky, not aimed at a specific aircraft, not trying to hit anything at this range. Instead, Crossley swept the stream of fire directly across the path the lead German fighter was taking, right in front of him, forcing him to make a choice: fly through the traces or break. The Bf-109 broke. Hard bank to the right. The sudden maneuver caught his wingman off guard. The second fighter had to dive to avoid collision. A third fighter, seeing the formation's lead disrupted, hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and that fraction of a second destroyed their coordinated attack. Instead of a precise, timed assault from multiple angles, the German formation scattered. Some went right, some went left, some dove, some climbed, and while they were recovering, while they were trying to regroup, Crossley kept firing, not long bursts, not sustained fire, but aggressive, continuous harassment. Every time a fighter tried to set up an attack angle, traces cut across his path. The psychological effect was immediate. These German pilots were experienced. Professional, they'd flown dozens, maybe hundreds of missions. They knew how bomber defensive fire worked. They knew to stay outside effective range until they were ready to commit. But now there was a madman in that tail turret who was firing at ranges that shouldn't be possible, who wasn't waiting for them to get close, who was actively disrupting their attack before it even began. It changed the equation, Sharon. One FW-190 pilot made a mistake. Instead of breaking away and resetting, he tried to power through, pushed his dive steeper, accelerated straight towards the tail of the brass rail. At 800 yards, he was still outside what the manual called effective range, but Crossley didn't care about the manual anymore. He led the target, calculated the angle, adjusted for the fighter's speed and trajectory, and held the triggers down. The 50 caliber stream walked right into the FW-190's flight path. The first hit sparked off the engine cowling. The second burst punched through the cockpit canopy. The third shredded the left wing root. The FW-190 rolled violently. Smoke poured from the engine. The pilot tried to recover, but the aircraft was finished. It went into a spin. 15,000 feet of altitude, tumbling out of control. At 8,000 feet, the pilot bailed out. Crossley watched the parachute deploy, watched the fighter continue to spin until it disappeared into the clouds below. Over the intercom, "Tail gunner, good kill, 1 confirmed." But Crossley was already scanning for the next threat. No, the German attack had fallen apart. What should have been a devastating assault from 12 fighters turned into a scattered, disorganized mess. Individual aircraft making opportunistic passes, but no coordination, no overwhelming firepower. The bomber formation held together, no stragglers, no cripples falling out of formation, and the brass rail flew on toward the target intact. After the fighters broke off, after they'd expended their ammunition or lost too many aircraft, there was a moment of relative quiet. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Tail, this is pilot. What the hell did you just do back there?" Crossley keyed his mic. "Stopped them before they could set up, sir." A pause. "By firing at 1,000 yards? You know that's not in the manual, right?" "Yes, sir, but the manual doesn't account for fighters that know the manual." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Well, whatever you did, keep doing it." But not everyone agreed. After the mission, after they dropped their bombs on Hanover, fought through more fighter attacks on the way home, and finally landed back at Horham, Crossley faced questions. The gunnery officer pulled him aside during debriefing. "Sergeant Crossley, I've been reviewing your ammunition expenditure." "Yes, sir." "You fired nearly 600 rounds on that first engagement alone, most of it at ranges exceeding 800 yards." "Yes, sir." "That's 3/4 of your total ammunition load. What would you have done if the fighters had come back for a second attack?" It was a fair question, a legitimate tactical concern. Crossley met the officer's eyes. "Sir, if I'd waited until they were in their optimal attack position, like the manual says, they would have shot us down on the first pass. I'd rather run low on ammo after breaking up their attack than save ammo while we're burning." The gunnery officer frowned. "Sergeant, the doctrine exists for a reason. Long-range fire is inaccurate. You got lucky with that kill, but you can't count on luck." "Sir, it wasn't luck. It was forcing them to react to me instead of me reacting to them. That's not how defensive gunnery works." "Maybe that's the problem, sir, Sonne." It was an insubordinate thing to say. Crossley knew it the moment the words left his mouth. But the gunnery officer didn't write him up, didn't threaten disciplinary action. Instead, he studied Crossley for a long moment. "1 kill," he said finally. "Confirmed, at 800 yards. That's unusual." "Yes, sir." You really think this aggressive firing technique works better than standard doctrine? I think it worked today, sir. The officer nodded slowly. If you're wrong, if this technique gets your crew killed because you ran out of ammunition, it's on you. Understood? Understood, sir. But if you're right, the officer almost smiled. Almost. If you're right, you might be onto something. Dismissed. Word spread through the 95th Bomb Group. The tail gunner on the brass rail had shot down an FW-190 at 800 yards, had broken up an entire fighter attack by firing early and aggressively, had done something nobody in the manual said you could do. Some gunners thought he was crazy, thought he'd just gotten lucky, thought he'd get himself killed on the next mission. Others were curious. Started asking questions. How did you lead the target at that range? How did you know when to fire? How did you keep from running out of ammo? And Crossley explained his thinking. You don't wait for them to get into position. You deny them the position. You make them react. You take away their ability to set up a perfect attack. But what if you miss? Then I miss. But at least I'm controlling the fight. At least I'm making them think twice. At least I'm in the game instead of just waiting to get shot. It was a philosophy, a tactical approach. And it was completely contrary to everything the Army Air Forces taught about defensive gunnery. But Donald Crossley didn't care, because he'd seen what happened when you followed the manual, and he'd decided that survival mattered more than doctrine. The next mission was July 24th. Target, Trondheim, Norway. A long flight over the North Sea. The fighters came. They always came. And this time, when they tried to set up their attack from 6 o'clock, Crossley opened fire at 900 yards. The lead fighter broke formation, the attack fell apart, and Crossley scored another kill, this time a Bf-109 that stayed in the fight too long and took a burst through the engine. 2 kills. 2 missions. The crazy tail gunner was becoming the deadly tail gunner. By August 1943, Donald Crossley had flown 12 missions. Most tail gunners didn't make it past 10. But Crossley wasn't just surviving, he was winning. His confirmed kill count stood at 5. 5 German fighters shot down. That was more than most gunners achieved in an entire combat tour, if they lived long enough to complete a tour at all. And the kills weren't flukes, weren't lucky shots. They were the result of a consistent, repeatable, tactical approach that nobody else was using. Aggressive early engagement, disrupt the attack formation, force fighters to react instead of execute, control the terms of the fight. It sounded simple when you said it out loud, but doing it at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures, with your hands shaking from adrenaline and cold, while fighters dove at you at 400 miles per hour, that was something else entirely. Crossley made it look easy. August 12, 1943. Target, Gelsenkirchen, deep in the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr was known as Flak Alley, for good reason. The concentration of anti-aircraft guns was the highest in Europe. The sky turned black with exploding shells. Bombers flew through it and came out looking like Swiss cheese. But flak wasn't the only problem. The Luftwaffe knew the Ruhr was valuable. They defended it aggressively. And on this mission, they came in force. Crossley counted at least 15 fighters in the first wave, Bf-109s and FW-190s, working in coordinated teams. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a planned, organized defense. The fighters split into 2 groups. Half went high, setting up for diving attacks from above. Half stayed level, preparing to hit the formation from behind. It was a smart tactic. Force the gunners to divide their attention, attack from multiple angles simultaneously. But Crossley had learned something over his previous missions. The fighters attacking from behind, from 6 o'clock, almost always followed the same pattern. They'd form up at long range, set their spacing, prepare for a coordinated dive. And during that preparation phase, they were predictable. As the rear group of fighters began to organize, Crossley could see the lead aircraft signaling to the others. He opened fire. 1,000 yards. Maybe more. The tracers streaked across the sky, cutting right through the space where the formation was trying to assemble. The lead Bf-109 broke left immediately. His wingmen scattered. But one fighter, either too aggressive or too inexperienced, tried to maintain position. Bad decision. Crossley adjusted his aim, led the target, squeezed the triggers. The .50 caliber stream caught the Bf-109 in the wing root. Pieces flew off. The fighter rolled violently and went into a flat spin. No parachute. The pilot either couldn't get out or chose not to try. 6 kills. Tank. Over the intercom, the waist gunner. Jesus, Tail, you got another one. The top turret gunner. That's 6, right? 6 confirmed? The pilot. Focus, everyone. We're not out of this yet. He was right. The fighters from the high group were diving now, coming in from 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock, head-on attacks that the tail gunner couldn't engage. Crossley listened to the nose gunner and top turret open fire, heard the sharp impact of 20mm cannon rounds hitting somewhere forward in the aircraft. "Number 2 engines hit," the flight engineer called out. "Still running but losing oil pressure." "Feather it," the pilot ordered. "We'll make it home on 3. But a B-17 with 1 engine out was a wounded animal, and wounded animals attracted predators. Sure enough, as the formation continued toward the target, more fighters appeared. They could sense weakness, could see the slight lag in the brass rails position. A pair of FW-190s swung around to attack from the rear. Crossley was ready. He'd learned to recognize the attack patterns now, knew how Luftwaffe pilots thought, knew they'd try to bracket their approach, one slightly high, one slightly low, to split his fire. He chose the high one, opened fire at 700 yards, walked the traces right into the fighter's flight path. The FW-190 pilot saw it coming, rolled hard right, too hard, lost control for just a moment. That moment was enough. Crossley adjusted, fired again, hit the fighter in the fuselage. Smoke, fire. The FW-190 dropped away, streaming flames, 7 kills. The mission wasn't over. They still had to drop their bombs, still had to fight their way back home through the same gauntlet of fighters and flak. But something had changed in the formation. The other crews had noticed, had watched Crossley in action, had seen what aggressive defensive fire could do, and they started copying it. The ball turret gunner on another B-17 opened fire early on an approaching fighter, broke up the attack before it developed. The waist gunners on a third bomber started firing at longer ranges, forcing German pilots to maneuver, to react, to lose their perfect firing solutions. It was spreading, the tactic, the philosophy. Stop being passive victims, start being active defenders. The Luftwaffe wasn't expecting it. Their tactics were built on bomber crews following doctrine, waiting for optimal range, firing conservatively. When the bombers started shooting earlier, more aggressively, disrupting attacks before they could develop, it changed the math. Fighters took more risks to get into position, which meant more exposure to defensive fire, which meant more losses. And the bomber crews noticed something remarkable. Fewer bombers were going down. August 17, 1943, a date that would live in 8th Air Force history, the double strike on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. 2 critical targets, deep penetration into Germany, no fighter escort for most of the route, the largest air battle of the war to that point. The 95th Bomb Group drew the Regensburg mission. The plan was audacious, hit Regensburg, then instead of returning to England, continue south and land in North Africa. Avoid flying the same route twice. The Luftwaffe threw everything at them. Crossley would later struggle to count how many fighter engagements he had that day. 10? 15? The attacks were continuous, relentless. But his tactic held. Every time fighters tried to set up from behind, he disrupted them, forced them to maneuver, made them pay for every attack approach. He scored 2 more confirmed kills that day, a Bf-109 at 800 yards, an FW-190 at 650 yards, 9 total, but the cost was staggering. The 95th Bomb Group lost aircraft. Good crews, friends. When they finally landed in North Africa, limping in with battle damage and wounded crew members, the ground crews stared at the bombers in disbelief. Every aircraft was shot to pieces. Holes in wings, engines destroyed, hydraulic systems damaged. But they'd made it. Against impossible odds, they'd made it. And in the tail turret of the brass rail, Donald Crossley had 9 confirmed kills, the highest scoring aerial gunner in the 8th Air Force. The publicity started after that. War correspondents looking for hero stories found Crossley's record. 9 kills, and counting, from a tail gunner position? That was news. The New York Times ran a story, called him sharp shooter of the air, described his aggressive firing technique, made him sound like a gunslinger in the Old West. Other newspapers picked it up. Crossley's photograph appeared in magazines back home. The kid from Wellsburg, West Virginia, suddenly famous. The Army Air Forces loved it. Good for morale, good for recruiting, good for the narrative that American fighting men were winning the air war over Europe. But Crossley didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor, a man who'd figured out a way to stay alive a little bit longer than the others. And he knew the war wasn't over, knew he still had missions to fly, still had fighters to face. September and October brought more missions, more combat, more kills. By the time Crossley completed his 23rd mission in late October 1943, his final tally stood at 12 confirmed kills. 12 German fighters shot down by a single tail gunner. It was a record that would stand throughout the war. No other aerial gunner in the European theater would match it. But the number itself didn't tell the whole story. Those 12 kills represented 12 times Crossley disrupted a fighter attack. 12 times he forced German pilots to make mistakes. 12 times he protected not just his own aircraft, but the entire formation around him. Because when fighters broke off from attacking the brass rail, they often ended up exposed to other gunners. When they lost their coordinated attack plans, they became easier targets for everyone. Crossley's aggressive tactics didn't just save his own life, they saved dozens of lives, maybe hundreds. The Army Air Forces took notice. After his 23rd mission, Crossley was pulled from combat operations. Not as punishment, as reward. He'd completed his tour, survived when most didn't, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster, Air Medal with 3 Oak Leaf Clusters, and now they wanted him to teach, to pass on what he'd learned, to train the next generation of aerial gunners in tactics that actually worked, rather than tactics that looked good on paper. Crossley agreed. Not because he loved teaching, not because he wanted to be safe, but because he'd watched too many good men die following doctrine that didn't account for reality. If he could teach gunners to think differently, to be aggressive instead of passive, to control the fight instead of react to it, maybe fewer of them would end up as names on casualty lists. But before he could start his new assignment, something happened, something that would later become one of the strangest chapters of Donald Crossley's war. An accident, a rumor, and a funeral for a man who wasn't dead. November 1943. Donald Crossley was alive. Against all odds, against all statistics, he was alive. 23 combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. 12 confirmed kills. Decorated. Famous, even. But survival came with a price that nobody talked about in the newspaper articles. The price wasn't physical. Crossley hadn't been wounded, hadn't taken shrapnel, hadn't been shot. The price was what he carried in his head. Every tail gunner who survived long enough developed the same problem. You sat in that turret for hours, watching, waiting, and when the fighters came, you had the best view of anyone on the aircraft. You saw everything. You saw the B-17 300 yards behind you take a direct hit to the bomb bay, saw it explode in a flash of orange fire, gone in an instant. 10 men, just gone. You saw parachutes. White flowers blooming against the grey European sky, you counted them, always counted them. 7 shoots from a 10-man crew meant 3 men didn't make it out, meant 3 men died in the aircraft, burning, falling, screaming into intercoms that no longer worked. You saw fighters go down, the ones you shot, the ones other gunners shot, and sometimes you saw the German pilots bail out, sometimes you didn't, and you had to live with that, because those German pilots, they had families too, mothers, wives, children waiting for them to come home, you knew that. Even in the middle of the fight, even while you were squeezing the triggers, you knew. Crossley never talked about this part, not to the reporters, not to the publicity officers, not even to most of his crew. But the other gunners knew. They understood. There was a look that combat veterans got, a distance in their eyes, a hesitation before they smiled, like they were somewhere else, somewhere over Germany, watching friends die, watching enemies die, watching death become routine. After his 23rd mission, Crossley was done flying combat. His tour was complete. He'd survived, but he hadn't escaped. The memories came at night, in the quiet moments, when there wasn't the roar of engines and gunfire to drown them out. He'd close his eyes and see the tail turret, see the fighters coming, see the tracers, see the kills. And he'd wonder, did I do the right thing? Did those 12 pilots I shot down deserve to die? Were they just doing their job, same as me? There were no good answers to those questions. Only the knowledge that if he hadn't shot them, they would have shot him, would have killed his crew, would have killed other crews. It was kill or be killed, but knowing that didn't make it easier. Around. After completing his combat tour, Crossley was reassigned. No more combat missions. Instead, he'd become a gunnery instructor. The Army Air Forces needed men like him, men who'd actually been there, who'd faced the Luftwaffe and survived, who could teach the tactics that worked instead of the tactics that looked good in manuals. Crossley was transferred to a new base, assigned to the gunnery training program, and that's when it happened. The accident occurred in late 1943 or early 1944. The exact date varies in different accounts, but the basic facts are consistent. Crossley was riding in a Jeep on base. A routine trip. Nothing dangerous. Nothing combat related. The Jeep crashed. The details are murky. Some accounts say the driver lost control. Others say they hit something. But the result was the same. The Jeep slammed into a wall or barrier at high speed. Crossley was badly injured. He was rushed to the base hospital. Critical condition, head trauma, internal injuries. The kind of injuries where the doctors talk in quiet voices and prepare for the worst. For several days, his survival was uncertain, and during those days, a rumor started. Someone, maybe a well-meaning clerk, maybe someone who misunderstood the severity of his injuries, sent word back to the 95th Bomb Group. Staff Sergeant Donald W. Crossley, killed in a vehicle accident. The news spread through the group like wildfire. The sharp shooter of the air was dead. The tail gunner with 12 kills. The man who'd survived 23 missions. Who'd beaten the odds. Who'd made it through when so many others hadn't. Dead. In a Jeep accident. On a safe base. Thousands of miles from combat. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. He'd survived the Luftwaffe. Survived Flak Alley. Survived Schweinfurt and Regensburg, and a dozen other missions that had killed better men. And a traffic accident had gotten him. The crews of the 95th Bomb Group mourned, raised glasses in his memory, told stories about the crazy tail gunner who fired at ranges nobody thought possible. Letters were written, condolences sent. His name was added to the mental list of men lost. And then weeks later, the 95th Bomb Group got another message. Staff Sergeant Donald W. Crossley was alive. He'd survived the crash. Against the odds, again, he'd survived. The injuries were serious but not fatal. He'd spent weeks in the hospital, weeks recovering. But he was alive. The killed in action report had been wrong, a mistake, a miscommunication, but the rumor had already spread. The story had already been told. For weeks, as far as the 95th Bomb Group knew, Donald Crossley was dead. And then he wasn't. Years later, fellow crew members would write about this in their memoirs and reunion newsletters, about the shock of learning Crossley had died, about the greater shock of learning he was alive. Leonard Herman, the bombardier on the brass rail, would later recount attending what he thought was a memorial service for Crossley, sharing memories of the missions they'd flown together, the fighters they'd faced together, only to discover at a post-war reunion that Crossley was standing right there, alive, older, but alive. Herman described it as one of the most surreal moments of his life, shaking hands with a ghost, talking to a man he'd mourned. But the Jeep accident left scars, not just physical, though those were real enough. Crossley carried injuries from that crash for the rest of his life. The deeper scars were psychological. He'd survived the war, survived when most tail gunners didn't, beat statistics that said he should be dead a dozen times over, and then nearly died in a stupid accident, a random moment of bad luck that had nothing to do with skill or tactics or bravery. It drove home a truth that every combat veteran eventually learns. You can't control everything. You can be smart, skilled, brave, do everything right, and still die because of random chance. Crossley had used tactics to take control of air combat, to shift the odds in his favor, to survive by refusing to be a passive victim. But the Jeep accident reminded him that some things are beyond control, some things are just luck. And the difference between living and dying can come down to nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong second. After he recovered, Crossley continued his work as a gunnery instructor. He taught the aggressive firing techniques he'd developed. taught new gunners to think proactively instead of reactively, to disrupt attacks instead of waiting to defend against them. And his lessons saved lives. Gunners who learned from Crossley went into combat with a different mindset. They weren't just waiting to get shot at, they were taking control of the fight. How many lives did that save? Impossible to know, but in the brutal calculus of war, every bomber that made it home was 10 men who didn't die. Every fighter shot down was one less threat to the next formation. Crossley's 12 kills were documented, recorded, celebrated. But his real legacy was the unknown number of kills by gunners he trained. The unknown number of bombers that survived because someone had taught their gunners to think differently. That legacy doesn't fit on a citation or medal, but it mattered. The war continued without him. Through 1944 and into 1945, the 8th Air Force continued its daylight bombing campaign. The tactics evolved. Fighter escorts became standard. P-51 Mustangs with the range to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe was gradually worn down. Experienced pilots killed. Fuel shortages. Newer, less trained pilots thrown into combat. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the air war was effectively over, and Donald Crossley, the tail gunner who'd been reported dead, who'd survived both the Luftwaffe and his own Jeep accident, was still alive, teaching, training, passing on the lessons learned in blood and fire over Germany. But he carried the weight of surviving when others didn't, the weight of the 12 men he'd killed, men with families, with lives, with futures cut short. The weight of knowing that his survival was part skill, part tactics, and part sheer random luck that could have gone the other way 100 different times. That's the price of being a survivor. You get to live, you get to go home, you get to have a future, but you carry the ghosts. Forever. The war ended in May 1945. Nazi Germany surrendered, the bombers stopped flying, the guns fell silent, and across England, thousands of American airmen prepared to go home. Donald Crossley was among them, the tail gunner who'd become a legend, the man with 12 confirmed kills, the sharp shooter of the air. But his impact on the war didn't end when he stopped flying. In fact, it was just beginning. In the years immediately following World War II, the United States Army Air Forces, which would become the independent United States Air Force in 1947, conducted extensive after-action analysis. They studied what worked, what didn't, what tactics saved lives, what doctrines got men killed. And when they looked at aerial gunnery, they found something interesting. Bomber formations that employed aggressive defensive fire, firing earlier, disrupting enemy attack formations before they could coordinate, had measurably better survival rates than formations that waited for optimal range before engaging. It wasn't a huge difference, maybe 5%, maybe 10%. But in a war where thousands of bombers flew tens of thousands of missions, 5% meant hundreds of aircraft saved, thousands of lives. The data backed up what Crossley had figured out through experience. Passive defense got you killed. Active defense kept you alive. And Crossley's name appeared in gunnery training materials published after the war, not always prominently, not always with full credit, but there, in sections about aggressive defensive tactics, in case studies about disrupting enemy attack patterns, in analyses of psychological factors in air combat, the tactic that had gotten him questioned by his superiors in 1943, the tactic that seemed suicidal, became standard doctrine by 1945. Fire early. Disrupt formations. Force the enemy to react. Don't wait to be a victim. It seems obvious now, but in 1943, it was revolutionary, and it came from a kid from West Virginia who'd had the nerve to question the manual and the skill to prove his questions were right. But Crossley's legacy extended beyond official doctrine. It lived in the stories. After the war, members of the 95th Bomb Group stayed in touch, formed veterans associations, held reunions, shared memories. And they always talked about Crossley, about the tail gunner who fired at ranges nobody thought possible, who broke up fighter attacks before they could develop, who'd survived 23 missions and become the highest scoring aerial gunner in the European theater. His story became part of the 95th Bomb Group's identity, part of their pride. We had the best tail gunner in the 8th Air Force. For the men who'd flown with him, who'd heard his guns open up from the tail turret, who'd watched German formations scatter, who'd made it home because he'd kept the fighters off their backs. Crossley was more than a statistic. He was the reason they were still alive. The reunions were where Crossley's story took on almost mythical proportions. Old men gathering decades after the war, sharing drinks, telling stories that got bigger and better with each retelling. Remember that mission to Gelsenkirchen, when Don shot down 2 fighters in the same pass? What about Regensburg? He must have fired at 50 different fighters that day. I swear he could hit a gnat at 1,000 yards. The details blurred. Numbers got exaggerated. Memories mixed with legend. But at the core, the truth remained. Donald Crossley had done something extraordinary, had survived the unsurvivable, had proven that unconventional thinking could beat overwhelming odds, and that truth mattered to the men who'd been there. From a tactical perspective, Crossley represented something important. He proved that individual initiative could change outcomes in modern warfare. The Second World War was a conflict of massive scale. Millions of men, thousands of aircraft, industrial-scale killing. It's easy to think of individual soldiers as cogs in a machine, replaceable parts, statistics. But Crossley demonstrated that even in that massive system, one person thinking differently could make a measurable impact. His tactic didn't win the war, didn't change the strategic outcome. The Allies were going to defeat Nazi Germany regardless of what one tail gunner did or didn't do. But his tactics saved lives, kept bombers in the air, kept formations intact. And for the crews who benefited from those results, that was everything. The historical record on Crossley is frustratingly incomplete. He didn't write a memoir, didn't give extensive interviews, didn't seek publicity after the war. What we know comes from official records, mission logs, decoration citations, gunnery school documents, and from the memories of the men who flew with him. Those memories, preserved in Veterans Association newsletters and reunion accounts, paint a consistent picture. A quiet professional, skilled, determined, not interested in glory, just interested in doing the job and getting everyone home alive. That humility is telling. Crossley could have leveraged his fame, could have parlayed highest-scoring aerial gunner in the ETO into a post-war career. Book deals, speaking tours, the celebrity circuit that many war heroes walked. He didn't. He went home, went back to work, lived a normal life. But among the men who knew what he'd done, among the veterans of the 95th Bomb Group, his name carried weight. There's a broader lesson in Crossley's story. It's about the difference between doctrine and reality. Doctrine is created by people far from the fight, people with good intentions, people trying to codify best practices and create repeatable systems. And doctrine is valuable, necessary, even. You can't run a military without standardized procedures, but doctrine can't account for everything. When you're actually in combat, when the enemy is adapting, when conditions are changing, when the situation on the ground or in the air doesn't match what the manual says, rigid adherence to doctrine can get you killed. Crossley understood this instinctively. He respected the manual, learned it, understood why it existed, but he also recognized when the manual was wrong, when reality and theory diverged, and he had the courage to act on that recognition. That's what made him exceptional, not superhuman reflexes, not perfect aim, but the willingness to question authority when the stakes were life and death. Tim. In the decades after the war, aerial combat changed dramatically. Jet aircraft, missiles, radar. Technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the men who flew B-17s over Germany. But the fundamental lesson of Crossley's tactics remained relevant. In combat, initiative matters, aggression matters. Forcing the enemy to react to you rather than the other way around can be the difference between survival and death. Modern fighter pilots learn this. It's baked into air combat doctrine now. But in 1943, it wasn't obvious. It took a tail gunner from West Virginia to prove it. Donald Crossley's official legacy is enshrined in the records: Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster, Air Medal with 3 Oak Leaf Clusters, 12 confirmed aerial victories, highest scoring aerial gunner in the European Theatre of Operations. Those are the facts. the numbers, the official recognition. But his real legacy isn't in the records. It's in the unknown number of bomber crews who made it home because their gunners had learned from his example. It's in the tactical doctrine that evolved to incorporate his insights. It's in the story passed down through generations of airmen about the tail gunner who refused to be a victim. That's the legacy that matters, not the medals, not the kill count, but the lives saved by one man's refusal to accept the way things had always been done.